Dear friend, across the vast expanse of philosophy and religion, there are questions that seem to echo eternally, like distant bells ringing across the ages. One such question whispers even now: is Buddhism merely a branch of Hinduism? Both traditions grew under the same ancient sky of India. Both speak of karma, samsara, and liberation. At a glance, they appear as two branches sprouting from a single sacred tree. But is that truly all there is? Or is there a deeper truth, a silent, luminous divergence, waiting to be seen beneath the surface? If you have ever wondered about the true relationship between these two great rivers of wisdom, then stay with me. Today, we will not merely trace the lines of history. We will journey beyond them, into the living heart of what sets these paths apart, and what they still share in the deepest silence. Welcome to Lotus of Dharma, a sanctuary where ancient truths are explored with a heart awakened by wonder. If you find nourishment in journeys like these, I invite you to subscribe, to leave a reflection in the comments below, and to walk with us through this unfolding path of insight. More than 2,500 years ago, upon the sacred soil of ancient India, a profound spiritual current stirred. The people of that time lived with a deep conviction that existence was an endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, spun by the invisible threads of karma. Each life was but a brief flicker in a vast continuum, where beings wandered through countless forms, seeking some elusive liberation. This was the vision of Sanatana Dharma, the eternal way, what the world now calls Hinduism. It was within this fertile ground of timeless inquiry that Siddhartha Gautama was born. He grew up breathing the air thick with sacred chants, ancient rituals, and the luminous philosophies of the East. He absorbed the truths of karma, samsara, dharma, and moksha as naturally as one absorbs the warmth of sunlight. Yet, there came a moment, silent yet shattering, when Siddhartha asked the question that few dared to contemplate: is there a way to end suffering, here and now, without waiting for endless lifetimes to pass? This was not a question born from rebellion, nor was it a rejection rooted in pride. It was the sincere cry of a heart that had tasted all the promises of worldly wisdom and found them unable to quench the thirst for true liberation. The sages of his time spoke of the Atman, the eternal soul, destined to reunite with Brahman after traversing the long river of countless births. But Siddhartha, gazing into the nature of life itself, saw something both wondrous and unsettling: that suffering was not a distant punishment, nor was freedom an unreachable shore. Suffering arose now, from craving now, from ignorance now. And so, liberation too must be accessible here, in this very breath, in this very step, not in some distant future imagined by the mind. This realization led him beyond the towering philosophies of his age, beyond the intricate rites and comforting metaphors of gods and heavens. He stepped out of the vast and ancient web woven by the thinkers of his time, not with disdain, but with profound compassion, for he knew that the deepest truth could never be captured by even the most beautiful words. In doing so, the Buddha did not renounce the soil that had nourished his quest. He honored it, just as a flower honors the earth from which it rises. Yet he also understood, to bloom fully into awakening, one must have the courage to break through the familiar and reach beyond the sky of old beliefs. Thus, Buddhism was not born as a mere branch of Hinduism, nor was it a rejection of it. It was, and remains, a luminous flowering of an ancient longing, the longing to see things as they truly are, without the veils of delusion, without the chains of desire, without the weight of conceptual walls. It is a call not to another world, but to this moment, pure, ungraspable, and infinitely sufficient. It is undeniable that Buddhism and Hinduism share many profound concepts. The law of karma, the principle that every action leaves an imprint and creates future consequences. The cycle of samsara, the endless wandering through birth, death, and rebirth. The yearning for moksha or nirvana, the final liberation from this cycle of suffering. If one gazes only at these surface reflections, it is easy to assume that Buddhism is merely a branch, a gentle reform of the ancient Hindu tradition. But to think so is to miss the quiet yet radical revolution that took place within the heart of the Buddha's realization. Indeed, the Buddha stood upon the same sacred ground, breathed the same ancient air, and spoke many of the same timeless words. Yet, from within that shared soil, he sought a path that no one before him had fully walked. While Hinduism spoke of an eternal soul, the Atman, unchanging and destined to merge with the ultimate reality called Brahman, the Buddha's gaze pierced deeper. He taught that no such unchanging self exists. Not in the body, not in the feelings, not in the thoughts, not even in the subtle awareness that we mistake for I. All conditioned things are impermanent. All that arises must pass away. Even what we call the self is but a river of causes and conditions, flowing without a fixed center. The doctrine of anatta, non-self, was not a mere philosophical statement, it was a thunderclap that shattered centuries of metaphysical assumptions. Where others sought to grasp and preserve a pure eternal essence, the Buddha invited us to see the beauty and liberation in letting go, in realizing that there is no entity to cling to, no separate I trapped in the cycle of becoming. Thus, while both traditions spoke of karma and rebirth, their understanding of the one who experiences these things differed profoundly. Hinduism spoke of a soul journeying through lifetimes. Buddhism spoke of a chain of causes and effects, rolling onward without a permanent traveler. It is like the flame of one candle lighting another, continuity without identity, movement without an enduring core. To recognize this difference is not to judge or diminish either path. It is to honor the distinct fragrance of each, and to understand why the lotus of Buddhism, though nourished by ancient waters, opened its petals in a direction all its own, a direction that pointed, not to the discovery of a hidden self, but to the liberation that comes when the self is seen as an illusion, and the heart rests in the freedom of what simply is. Yet if we wish to truly grasp the extraordinary nature of the Buddha's realization, we must look even more closely, for it was not merely a gentle divergence from the philosophies of his time, but a profound reimagining of the entire spiritual quest. In three essential ways, the Buddha turned the prevailing assumptions upside down, offering a radically new vision of the path to liberation. The first great turning was the doctrine of anatta, the principle of non-self. In the spiritual traditions surrounding him, it was almost universally accepted that behind the changing phenomena of life there must exist a permanent soul, the Atman, pure, unchanging, untouched by suffering. This Atman was believed to be of the same nature as Brahman, the universal essence. To realize this eternal soul was seen as the highest purpose of life. But the Buddha, through the clarity of his meditation and the sharpness of his insight, saw that when one examines all layers of experience, the body, the feelings, the perceptions, the thoughts, even the consciousness itself, nowhere can a fixed self be found. Everything that we cling to as I or mine is, in truth, impermanent, conditioned, and without independent existence. He saw that clinging to the idea of a permanent self was itself the root of suffering. Freedom is not attained by discovering a hidden essence, but by realizing the empty, dynamic nature of all existence, flowing, interdependent, free from any graspable core. Thus, the Buddha invited beings to stop searching for what does not exist and instead to awaken to the wonder and peace of letting go. The second great turning was his emphasis on self-reliance over divine salvation. In the religious culture of his time, gods and cosmic forces played a central role in human destiny. It was believed that through devotion, ritual, and supplication, a being could earn divine favor and be lifted out of suffering. But the Buddha saw that no external power, no god however mighty, could grant true liberation. Freedom is not something given from outside, it is a transformation that must happen within. Thus, he spoke with fearless clarity, by oneself is evil done, by oneself is one purified. Purity and impurity depend on oneself, No one can purify another. Even the Buddhas themselves do not save by grace, they simply point the way. It is each being's own wisdom, mindfulness, and effort that must open the gate. In this, the Buddha placed ultimate responsibility and ultimate empowerment in the hands of each individual. Liberation is not a favor to be begged for, but a path to be walked with one's own feet. The third great turning was his insistence on the immediacy of liberation, the ending of suffering here and now. While other systems spoke of moksha, final release, as something to be achieved after countless lives of purification, the Buddha brought the question urgently into the present moment. Why must freedom be postponed into an unknown future? Why not seek the root of suffering in this very life, in this very mind, and see through it directly? Suffering, he taught, is not some cosmic punishment for a distant original sin. It is a present process, arising from craving, ignorance, and clinging, and it can be ended by understanding and letting go of these causes. Thus, he offered not a hope for eventual redemption, but a living path, the Noble Eightfold Path, a way of ethical living, mindful awareness, and penetrating insight that leads to the cessation of suffering in this very life. In these three radical insights, the denial of an eternal self, the insistence on personal responsibility, and the immediacy of liberation, the Buddha reshaped the spiritual landscape forever. He honored the ancient soil from which he came, but he dared to plant new seeds, seeds that have blossomed for centuries into forests of wisdom, compassion, and freedom. His was not a path of mere belief, nor a hope deferred to a future life, but a call to direct awakening, here, now, within the tender, fleeting, and luminous reality of each moment. If we now turn our gaze from the realm of philosophy to the unfolding of history, we find the distinction between Buddhism and Hinduism becoming even clearer. Though the Buddha was born into a Hindu culture, though he spoke its language and knew its traditions intimately, from the moment of his awakening, his teaching took on a life of its own, like a river that, though it springs from the same mountain, carves a separate path through the world. In the centuries following the Buddha's passing, the Sangha, the community of monks, nuns, and lay followers, grew steadily across India and beyond. It established its own monastic codes, its own sacred scriptures, its own distinct philosophical schools. While Hinduism remained deeply intertwined with caste structures, ritual sacrifices, and the authority of the Vedas, Buddhism offered a different vision, a universal path open to all, regardless of birth, wealth, or social rank. It was a path rooted not in inherited status, but in personal effort and inner realization. Even politically, the two traditions grew apart. Kings such as Ashoka, one of India's greatest rulers, embraced Buddhism and spread its teachings across vast territories, sending monks as far west as Greece and as far east as Sri Lanka. Buddhist monasteries flourished along trade routes, becoming centers not only of spirituality but of education, philosophy, and the arts. Meanwhile, Hinduism continued to evolve along its own lines, weaving together countless deities, stories, and rituals into a vast, living tapestry. There were times when the two streams flowed near each other, even influenced each other in form and expression. Hindu schools such as Vedanta later absorbed some Buddhist insights into the nature of emptiness and impermanence. Buddhist thought, in turn, sometimes used Hindu vocabulary to reach across familiar cultural bridges. But the core remained distinct. Hinduism sought union with an eternal self and an ultimate God. Buddhism pointed toward the seeing through of all concepts of self, and a freedom found not in merging with the infinite, but in transcending the very need to grasp at anything at all. Over time, Buddhism itself diversified into many schools, Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, each with its own emphasis and style, yet all rooted in the same fundamental insight the Buddha realized under the Bodhi tree, that suffering arises from clinging, and freedom comes through letting go. Thus, history too bears witness. Buddhism did not remain a hidden branch within Hinduism, nor a mere reformation from within. It became a vast and luminous forest of its own, shading many lands, many peoples, many hearts. A path carved not out of rebellion, but out of deep compassion for the suffering of all beings, and out of an unyielding dedication to the direct and liberating truth. And yet, despite the clear divergence in history, philosophy, and practice, even today, many still perceive Buddhism as simply a branch of Hinduism. This confusion is understandable. From the outside, the two traditions seem to share so much: the belief in karma, the acceptance of rebirth, the reverence for meditation, and the aspiration for a liberation beyond the ordinary sufferings of life. Both traditions also express themselves through rich rituals, intricate philosophies, and a profound respect for the unseen currents that shape existence. Both employ Sanskrit terms, tell stories of cosmic cycles, and cultivate a reverence for teachers and sages. When seen from afar, it is easy for the casual observer to mistake deep similarity for sameness. Yet what is similar is not always the same. The moon and a pearl may both be white and luminous, but their nature, their weight, their origin, are entirely different. So too with Hinduism and Buddhism. What may seem like shared concepts are often inhabited with profoundly different meanings. Karma, in Buddhism, is intimately tied to intention. It is not fate decreed by cosmic law but the direct unfolding of volition and action in the present. Liberation, in Buddhism, is not reunion with an absolute self but the ending of all craving, all clinging, through the realization of non-self. To see only the common vocabulary and miss the different spirit is to confuse the signpost with the path itself. Hinduism, in its essence, seeks the rediscovery of an eternal identity. Buddhism invites the joyful realization that there is no fixed identity to be found, and that in this very freedom from identity lies the end of suffering. Thus, though the outer forms sometimes mirror each other, the inner journeys are distinct, like two travelers who set out from the same village but choose roads that diverge ever wider as the journey unfolds. Understanding this difference is not a matter of clinging to division or exalting one path over another. Rather, it is an invitation to honor the unique gift that each tradition offers to the human heart. If Hinduism teaches that the ultimate goal is to recognize our true self and merge it back into the divine ocean of Brahman, Buddhism shows a different way, to look deeply into the nature of this very self we cherish, and to see that it is like a mirage, a story woven by conditions, without lasting substance. One path speaks of discovery, the other of relinquishment. One points to eternal being, the other to profound emptiness. And yet, both arise from the same noble yearning, the yearning to be free from sorrow, to awaken from the dreams of suffering, to return to a state of pure, boundless peace. By seeing the distinct visions of Hinduism and Buddhism, we do not create walls. We cultivate clarity. We realize that the heart of the Buddha's teaching is not a refinement of old ideas, but a daring and compassionate reimagining of human liberation. It is the call to awaken not by becoming more, but by holding less, not by acquiring hidden truths, but by letting go of the very clinging that obscures truth. It is an invitation to sit quietly, to see clearly, and to realize, not after countless lives, not in some distant paradise, but here, now, that the freedom we seek has never been outside of ourselves. Thus, the Buddha's path, though it sprang from the same sacred soil, grew into a different forest, one where the winds whisper not of finding oneself, but of losing the need to find, and in that letting go, to awaken to a freedom more intimate than breath, more vast than the sky. If one day you find yourself standing between two towering mountains, one named Hinduism, the other Buddhism, and wonder quietly, which path shall I follow? Remember this. Both mountains arise from the same deep yearning within a human heart, the yearning to find true freedom, to awaken from suffering, to return home to the vastness beyond fear and desire. Yet, the ways they offer are different, the visions they hold are distinct. Buddhism is not merely a small branch growing from the ancient tree of Hinduism. It is a flower that blossomed from the same sacred soil, yet unfolded its petals in a direction uniquely its own, carrying a fragrance, a color, and a silence unlike any other. If this reflection has helped you see more clearly the delicate and profound relationship between these two ancient paths, I invite you to leave a comment below. Share with us, how do you feel about the differences between Hinduism and Buddhism? And where are you now, in your own journey of awakening? Thank you for walking this path with Lotus of Dharma today. May you always find the light of true freedom blooming quietly in the sanctuary of your own heart. Until we meet again, in the next journey of wisdom and wonder.